So I just finished reading this book here, The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist, which has nothing to do with this video topic, other than the fact that it took me 10 times longer than I expected. It was a difficult, challenging read. And it reminded me of the value of reading those kind of books, those hard books. And it's something I want to talk about in this video. Why you should read hard books, how to choose the right books to read, and then how to actually engage in the process and not fail, because so many of us start these kind of books and then we quit 20 pages in. So we're going to dive into that. I want to start with the why. In a world that fractures your attention and pushes you towards the urgent, why should you read, especially if you're busy, right? Because reading hard books, it takes time, it takes attention, it takes energy. Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that challenging books shape you in a way that easy books don't. There's a qualitative difference between pushing your way through a difficult book that interests you, really stretches your mind when you try and comprehend it, and blitzing through the latest pop psychology or self-help bestseller. It's not that these easy self-help books are bad, they can have a significant impact on you, but most of the time they don't. You read them, you feel good in the moment, you pick up a few fun facts, and then you forget about it all while moving on to the next one or moving on with your life. Hard books, on the other hand, they demand this sort of directed attention, and this produces a sort of mental energy, which in turn leads to better understanding, depth, and comprehension. For example, you can skim through a book like Atomic Habits and you can pick up a lot of ideas, a lot of tactics. You can kind of understand what it's about, but to do it with a book like The Master and His Emissary, you just won't really understand what's going on. You miss so much context by not giving it the time and attention that it needs. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. With easy books, I can be sitting downstairs in the living room, kind of half distracted. My wife's talking to me. I still know what's going on. But with this, there were numerous times where I was, sitting on the couch trying to read this, and I'd get distracted by something, some sort of noise, and it just pulled me out of it. I got frustrated. I couldn't make sense of what was going on. I needed that space, that quiet, that solitude to read that book and other challenging books. And that space and solitude that lets you drive attention towards something is exactly what leads to understanding in depth. There's also another element to this, which is that when something requires less effort and attention from you, that it requires less work, you tend not to value it as much. What's easily gained is easily lost. And I can't tell you how many mainstream books and podcasts and so on that have exited my brain as soon as they've entered, simply because they've just been easy to consume. Whereas the ideas that have truly stuck with me are ones that I've had to wrestle with, look at from all angles, ponder, synthesize. What is earned the hard way feels, and perhaps fundamentally is, more valuable. The next reason why you should read hard books is that some of the most interesting ideas are in such books. Back to McGilchrist's work, because it's top of mind for me, his books, they're not underground. It's a popular book, but it's never going to be as popular as an Atomic Habits or a Thinking Fast and Slow, or perhaps another book that's mainstream. And that's simply because it's more challenging to read. And as a result, the topics have a smaller audience. There's a smaller total addressable market, right? And due to the limits of language, some ideas cannot be presented in easy to understand writing. Some ideas, like the interplay between the left and right hemisphere of the brain and their effects on culture, that's a complex idea. It can't be boiled down to a single paragraph or a chapter without losing important detail. It requires a exposition of 400 pages or so. It's not that interesting ideas don't exist in easy books. It's that to gain a high resolution understanding of certain ideas requires a difficulty and complexity that you have to work through. Another reason it's useful to read hard books is that it forces you to focus, and it helps develop your attention span. In an age of distraction like the one we live in now, being able to sit down for an hour or two and deeply concentrate on one thing is a skill, and it's a skill that's in short supply. Reading hard books helps you develop the skill. because really there's no other way to read hard books. Like I mentioned earlier, when you're constantly distracted, you can't focus. You can't really develop a coherent understanding of what's going on the pages because you keep skipping around and getting interrupted and so on. Developing this skill of focus opens the world up because focus is a force multiplier, something I've talked about many times on the channel. If you can sit down and you can push through challenging texts, through challenging books, then you can likely push yourself through other types of intellectual work as well. And on the topic of work, I think you should treat reading hard books as a form of work. I think you should frame it that way in your brain because it will mean you're more likely to actually do it. If you don't, then you can constantly choose other things that feel more urgent or feel more important because those things are considered work. I think Ryan Holiday says you should treat reading as work, and I agree with him. Okay, so how do you choose what to read? Well, there are 3 tips I'll share with you on this. The first is to follow curiosity. When someone else tells you, hey, you should read this book, it's a hard book, but it'll be worthwhile, and you just take their word for it, but you're not really interested in the topic, it doesn't mean anything to you, you're probably not going to finish that book, right? Whereas if you come across a book through your own exploration, your own curiosities, then you're far more likely to actually engage with it and finish it because it's something you're interested in. Curiosity makes reading hard books enjoyable because you want to gain understanding. And the funny thing is, as you read more, you often become more curious about everything, and so it opens up your world and you can read all different types of books. Still, there are topics that you are likely curious about and you will push through the hard and boring passages in a book to learn more about them. And there are topics you aren't curious about or aren't curious enough about where you won't do that unless you're forced to because you're studying for an exam or what have you. For example, I can read about psychology, neuroscience, human performance, business all day long, right? That's the world I live in. The intersection of these topics helps me in my business. It helps me as a coach. It helps me understand myself. But I really struggle to push my way through dry academic philosophy, especially that which lacks practicality. Some people love that stuff. They can read it all day. Some people are curious about it. I'm not. And so it's like pushing uphill. You want to find the hill that's easier for you to climb, but it's still challenging, right? So curiosity leads to commitment, and commitment is what you need if you're going to read a hard book. The second tip is to read based on reason and outcomes. So one of the things that drew me to this book in particular and had me stick with it over months, it wasn't just that I was curious about the topic. I certainly was, but it was also because I was confident that it would help me personally just in life, and it would help the clients I work with. In other words, it had an immediate reward in that it satiated my curiosity, but it would likely lead to other rewards too. Being better at my craft, a reshaping of my worldview, a deeper understanding of myself and others, and so on. So when choosing a book, it's useful to just ask yourself, you don't need to be super analytical about this, but just ask, what are the outcomes of reading this? What are the indirect outcomes, the meta outcomes that I get from this as well? And why do I think it's worth weeks and months of my time? This is something you will likely do naturally and intuitively anyway. And if you feel, drawn to reading a certain book, then you don't need to analyze that any further. You don't need to rationalize it, but it can be worth externalizing if you're struggling to decide between 2 or more books. The third tip here is to do inspectional reading and scanning. It's quite hard to commit to a hard book until you have an idea of what it's about. And it's quite hard to get an idea of what a book is like and what it's about until you've scanned through it. This is something that Mortimer Adler of How to Read a Book talks about, this inspectional reading, picking it up and spending 30 to 60 minutes looking at the table of contents, looking through a few pages, just seeing what's in there, looking at the style, and then making a judgment call about whether it's worth reading. Because there are some books you pick up and you do this inspectional reading and you realize this is not what I thought it was. I'm not going to dedicate, 12, 20 hours to reading this. It's just not worth it for me. Okay, so how do you actually engage in the process? What are some tips for reading these hard books? The first is to create space and time. So without distraction, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to reiterate. Reading is a serious task and it should be treated as such. It's an active, not a passive task. Yeah, you can listen to a podcast or a YouTube video while you're doing something else, while you're doing the dishes or going for a walk or at the gym. Reading is not like that. It requires attention and focus, as we talked about. You need energy and you need focus. You will not get through hard books if they're sitting on your nightstand and you only read them at the end of the day when you're exhausted. It's just not going to happen. And you also won't get through them if you don't carve out time and space to concentrate free of distraction. Your ability to elicit meaning from difficult texts requires immense mental resources. And if you're always context switching due to external distractions, or you're grabbing your phone as soon as you feel stuck at a hard passage, then you'll fail to read and understand. You'll end up reading 5 pages and then you'll be like, what did I just read? I didn't comprehend any of that. Your eyes traveled across a page, but you didn't actually take any of it in. So mental energy, space, time. Figure out how to utilize these. For me, I like to read late afternoon, usually outside if it's good weather, or in my office here. If it's noisy, then I'll put some headphones on. And I commit to a minimum time frame, just like I would if I was working on a task. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be reading this book. I'm not going to check my phone. I'm not going to do anything else. And I do this because I know that hard books generate a resistance. And without committing to a time period, then I'll have a tendency to just give up after 15 or 20 minutes. So create space, create time, use energy when you have it. Don't wait until the very end of the day to read unless that's the only time you have. Second is to let curiosity guide your depth. Mortimer Adler in How to Read a Book suggests that you should read hard books fast, knowing that you won't understand everything. Now, this advice is worth heeding, but I like to take a modified approach. First, trying to understand everything in a hard book is an inefficient approach, right? Because first of all, you can't. I didn't understand everything in this book, and I'm okay with that. Even if you could, it'd take you forever. And third, you don't really care to understand everything anyway. And so you want to let curiosity dictate how deep or shallow you go. And in the case of reading The Master and His Emissary, there were some parts that, for whatever reason, I just had to pause and understand more deeply. They were very important. I was very curious about them. And, I would consult ChatGPT, for instance, or do some Google research to try and really figure out what was going on. And then there were other parts that I didn't skim through, but I really worked through a bit faster because they didn't spark my curiosity as much. I didn't need to go as deep on them. So you want to let your curiosity drive depth. And this is something you would likely do anyway if you weren't so analytical and systematic like me. It's yeah, of course, it's just called reading, bro. You don't need to theorize about this. It's also why I think goals like 25 pages a day are kind of dumb, because sometimes a page, a single page, takes you 15 minutes because you're like, damn, what is he really saying here? And you just have to read it over and over again. And if it's a 25-page goal, then you just kind of skip past it and you lose out on a lot when you have goals like that. The next tip is assistance. So often you'll come across something you don't fully understand, but it's something that feels crucial to the rest of your book, or it's something you're very curious about, right? If you don't understand it, what follows may be hard to contextualize or make sense of. Not always, but in some books this is the case. It's like mathematics. You need to have a certain foundational knowledge, and you're not going to understand this concept up here if you don't have this. It's just not going to make any sense to you. What you shouldn't do, in my opinion, is open up your phone and use Google or ask AI straight away. There is value in wrestling with the text for a bit and trying to understand it by yourself first based on what else is going on in the book. If you always grasp for external help reflexively every time you encounter a struggle, then you will atrophy this part of your brain, right? You'll atrophy the problem solving, thinking, wrestling part. But let's say you've done this for a bit and you still don't really understand it and you kind of need some help. This is where assistance comes in. It might be another related book that serves as a prerequisite to understanding it. It might be a simple Google search to understand a term, or a YouTube video that explains the concept in a more visual form. Most of the time, When I need assistance, I just ask ChatGPT, and I'll use voice mode. The advanced voice mode is really good. And yes, having my phone nearby does make me more prone to distraction, but I love being able to simply ask it questions while I'm reading without even looking up from the page. And there's a video from Dan Schipper on how to do this, which I recommend checking out. One more point on this, and this is another reason to read relatively quickly and not worry too much about comprehending everything, is that often these things you don't quite understand will become understood later in the book when you have the wide context. If I recall correctly, Mortimer Adler in How to Read a Book talks about the three or four like stages of reading. I think it's 3. The first one being inspectional reading, and he kind of says like, don't stop at each point where you don't understand it. Just like read through the whole book, and then if you need to understand it more, read through the book again, because you're never going to finish if you just like hyper focus on things you don't understand all the time. Just skim past them, keep moving, finish the book. And finally, talk, write, externalize. I went into this topic in depth in my last video on using writing to sharpen your thinking. So I recommend checking that out if you want a deep dive on this. But in short, externalization is a powerful way to strengthen retention. It's one of the reasons why I made this video, to solidify and strengthen some ideas from books that I've read. Externalization is a powerful way to strengthen retention. It's one of the reasons I make YouTube videos in the first place, because it forces me to synthesize my ideas that I've often got from books. How you externalize is up to you, but I recommend at least some form of writing, even if it's taking your own notes. Keyword there, your own. You got to make them original. Writing forces you to synthesize, consolidate, and simplify, right? If you have accommodating friends, then you can engage in conversation with them. Ideally, you read the same book together, and so you can like cross-reference ideas. And yeah, just externalize in some way, shape, or form. Don't just highlight. Like that's what a lot of people do. They'll just highlight like I've done here. You can see all the marks. Maybe they write like a word or two in the margin, but that doesn't really lead to retention or comprehension. You kind of got to write your own thoughts and your own summaries to have it really stick in your head. So that is it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other thoughts on this, on reading hard books, I'd love to hear them. Leave a comment below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.